Welcome back everyone, I'm Eric from Rare Candy, and here today we have a special little end of the year video I've put together going over what are, at least in my opinion, the top 10 cards of 2020 for the Pokemon TCG. Now, it is no secret that 2020 really hasn't been the best of years in recent memory for a couple of obvious reasons, but in terms of the Pokemon trading card game, it's honestly been a pretty great year overall. We've seen a resurgence in interest in the game just kind of as a whole. We've seen the online tournament scene explode due to a lack of physical events. And we kicked off the beginning of the year with a new era of the game with the first Sword and Shield set, continuing all the way through the end of the year, giving us, I think, around 900 new cards, if I counted correctly. So today we're going to narrow that down to just 10 cards, plus a couple of honorable mentions that didn't quite make the cut. But before we get to the actual countdown, just a few things for housekeeping. Only one version or rarity of a card is going to be eligible to appear on this list, meaning that a card like Zacian V, while being a card that got printed multiple times throughout 2020, can only take up one spot, as to avoid a countdown that honestly would otherwise look as hellish and dystopian as something like this. And also, only new cards from 2020 can appear, meaning that older staples such as Rare Candy or Switch, while still being great cards and seeing new prints this year, aren't going to be making an appearance since they were previously already legal in the standard format. And if you do find that you've been enjoying these countdown videos that I've been doing more of on the channel lately, be sure to smack that like button, as it genuinely really does help get this video seen by more Pokemon TCG fans on YouTube. And like I said, we have over 900 new cards this year, so narrowing things down to just 10 was a little tricky, and no doubt as a result my list is probably going to look a little bit different from yours. So if you have some thoughts of your own, I want to hear your top 10 picks for the year down below in the comment section after you watch this video. But with all that out the way, let's hop into the countdown and see what made the cut. Coming in for our first honorable mention, we have the Galarian Obstagoon evolution line back from the Sword and Shield base set. While I think Galarian Zigzagoon has probably seen a little bit more widespread play just because it's a much more splashable card, I definitely think Galarian Obstagoon is worth shouting out here as well, as it has appeared in a number of successful decks, ranging from its own deck back during the earlier Sword and Shield sets, and even still today sees play in the Decidueye Galarian Obstagoon deck. But Galarian Zigzagoon, whenever you play this Pokemon from your hand, you may put one damage counter on one of your opponent's Pokemon. Galarian Obstagoon does the same thing, but for 3 damage counters, but its Obstruct attack is really what makes that card in particular so good. 90 damage, and then it prevents all damage done to this Pokemon by attacks of basic Pokemon. I'm personally a sucker for these ability-based forms of damage like we've seen in the past, whether it be Decidueye GX, even going further back to cards like Chandelure for Nimble Victories. Just a big fan of this evolution line. I think these cards wound up narrowly missing the official top 10, just because Obstagoon has been demoted to more of like a secondary attacker in the Decidueye deck. It hasn't been seeing too much play outside of that. But nevertheless, guys, this evolution line from the Sword and Shield era of the game is really cool, and happy that we did get it this year. And for our other honorable mention, we have Centiskorch V Max. Centiskorch came out not too long ago back in Darkness Ablaze, but it's definitely been a pretty impactful VMAX that we've had. For the Gmax Centiferno attack, it does 40 plus 40 more for each fire energy attached to this Pokemon. If you did any damage with this attack, you may attach a fire energy from discard to this Pokemon. Centiskorch is just such a beast because if your opponent doesn't have a quick answer to challenge your Centiskorch and they just give you a couple turns to get a ton of energy on this thing, it can just sort of blow through anything your opponent might be able to set up, including sometimes opposing Pokemon V Max. This guy is definitely a massive heavy hitter and has managed to see a good bit of play with some decent success as well, despite having a lot of competition with other fire Pokemon to be played alongside Welder. While Centiskorch has found a good bit of success, pretty consistently popping up as one of the higher performing decks in the game, I think in terms of final finishes, it is a little bit shy of the success of some of the other Pokemon that we're about to take a look at on this official top 10. But nevertheless, Centiskorch is a fantastic fire Pokemon and will no doubt continue to see plenty of play leading all the way up until next summer when Welder unfortunately does rotate. But coming in at number 10 on our list, we are going to be looking at a card that is very near and dear to my heart, and that is going to be Decidueye back from Darkness Ablaze. Decidueye is like everything I love in Pokemon. It's one of my favorite Pokemon from any of the games. It's a stage 2 that abuses Rare Candy. It's a single prize Pokemon, and most importantly, it has the Deep Forest Camo ability that gives the middle finger to opposing Pokemon V and GX, since it does prevent all damage done from those Pokemon's attacks to this Pokemon. Its attack also is okay as well for grass colorless, is 90 and 20 to 2 of your opponent's bench Pokemon. But again, the big selling point of this card is this ability and really is what makes it so good. So while the attack on Decidueye isn't the heaviest hitting, you don't even really mind because most decks right now that are popular in the game are Pokemon V and Pokemon GX based decks. So really the damage you're doing is almost irrelevant as long as you're doing some amount of damage, because eventually you will knock out those Pokemon if they don't have a way to answer your Decidueye, even if it does take slightly longer than you would expect. Now, unfortunately, in Vivid Voltage, we did just see the release of Aegislash V, which could wind up being a pretty big thorn in Decidueye's side going into 2021. So it kind of remains to be seen if Decidueye is going to be as dominant and as viable going into the new year. But in 2020, this card did see a good bit of success, and one that I am personally ecstatic about to be able to include on this top 10. Next up, coming in at number 9, we have Eldegoss V. Eldegoss V is another member of a long line of multi-prize support Pokemon we've seen over the years, whether it be cards like Jirachi EX, Shaman EX, Tapu Lele GX, etc. These styles of Pokemon have consistently been good, and Eldegoss V is no exception. Has a very powerful coming into play ability. Whenever you play this Pokemon from hand onto your bench during your turn, you may put a supporter card from your discard pile back into your hand. So while I don't think it's quite as strong as something like Tapu Lele GX from the past, as you do have to wait for supporters to hit your discard rather than searching your deck, this sort of effect is no stranger at being good over the years. Most notably, the card Versus Seeker comes to mind, had this exact effect in the form of an item, saw widespread play. Eldegoss V has not popped up as a 3 or 4 of, like in the case of Versus Seeker, but has consistently seen play to allow people a way at finding their welders, their final bosses, or to take that last KO they need for the game, to bail themselves out of a dead hand with a Professor's Research, whatever it might be. And I imagine going into 2021, that is only going to continue as we get more and more supporters injected into the card pool. And that's why Eldegoss V is going to take the number 9 spot. Coming in at number 8, we have Scoop Up Net. This was a card that came out back in Rebel Clash, but it says put one of your Pokemon that isn't a Pokemon V or a Pokemon GX and put it into your hand and discard all attached cards. So while there are a lot of powerful abilities on Pokemon V and Pokemon GX, there's also still a ton of really good abilities on single prize Pokemon as well. Some of the popular uses we've seen with this card over the past year have been things like Galarian Zigzagoon, which we already looked at. More recently, we've seen cards like Giratina pop up in decks like Dragapult VMAX and even some Fire decks to deal with Weakness Guard energy. We've also seen this for cards like the Minor Report Mewtwo, Harangaroo from Sword and Shield, even continuing to make the Stellar Wish Jirachi a viable card despite losing a skateboard in last year's rotation as well. Scoop Up Net is a card I'm a big fan of. I love when we get support for single prize Pokemon and single prize decks, and Scoop Up Net is definitely a card that enables a lot of really cool plays and turns a lot of Pokemon that otherwise probably wouldn't see that much play into suddenly viable cards. So Scoop Up Net, fantastic card. I imagine 2021 is going to give us even more coming into play abilities for Scoop Up Net to abuse, so I imagine this will still be a good card even going into next year as well. Coming in at number 7, we finally have another primary attacker on this list, and that is going to be Eternatus VMAX, the star of the Darkness Ablaze set. But Eternatus is a hefty Pokemon VMAX coming in at an insane 340 HP. Has this Eternal Zone ability much like the old Skyfield. It grants you up to 8 Pokemon on your bench, but the catch is they do all have to be Dark type. And then its attack for a Dark and Colorless, much like the old Mega Rayquaza EX that I personally also am a pretty big fan of. It does 30 damage, but this one's times the amount of Dark Pokemon in play. But luckily for Eternatus, there's no shortage of great Dark Pokemon. We already did look at the Galarian Zigzagoon back on our honorable mentions, but Darkness Ablaze also delivered Eternatus another very powerful Dark-type Pokemon that may or may not also be included on this list later on as well. Eternatus has a pretty low maintenance attack cost of only 2, allowing it to scale up to hitting 270 damage without having to expend much effort at all, and that's before factoring in damage that comes from some of your other Dark Pokemon. This card is very heavy hitting, easy to get set up, and has been pretty much a force to be reckoned with ever since it did come out. And while the upcoming Battle Style set is promising some strong new fighting Pokemon V and VMAX, until then I don't see any signs of Eternatus slowing down going into the new year. Coming in at the number 6 spot is going to be our first supporter card, and that is going to be Marnie. This was a card that came out back in the Sword and Shield base set, but to supporter, each player shuffles their hand and puts it on the bottom of their deck. If either player put cards on the bottom of their deck in this way, you draw 5 and your opponent draws 4. So kind of like the old Judge from back in the day, but this is, I think, a little bit of a stronger effect. One of the reasons I think Marnie is actually probably a better card than Judge overall is the fact that it puts the cards on the bottom of the deck, meaning if you see your opponent, just as an example, use a Stellar Wish to grab a Boss's Orders for next turn, you can play Marnie on your following turn, and not only do you remove that card from your opponent's hand, but it goes straight to the bottom of their deck, making it even harder to find those key cards that they were relying on for the following turn. And with us losing some of our better draw options in the rotation last year, Marnie has really been a stellar secondary supporter for most decks to be able to play. So while it's probably not my favorite supporter you'll see on this countdown, it is absolutely one of the best ones that 2020 has given us. Marking the halfway point on this countdown, we have Crobat V, a card we did allude to a little bit earlier in this countdown. But Crobat V, much like Eldegoss V, is another one of these very powerful multi-prize support Pokemon, and it has the Dark Acid ability. Whenever you play this Pokemon from your hand onto your bench during your turn, you may draw cards until you have 6 cards in your hand, but you can't use more than 1 Dark Acid ability each turn. Crobat V has been an insane card for a number of different reasons this year. I think one of the most obvious ones is that it gives the Eternus VMAX deck a very strong consistency engine. By allowing you to play Crobat V every single turn, you get to see more cards than most decks will be able to, and each one that you play down is going to be plus 30 damage per turn, which is also really awesome. But even outside of that, one of the downsides to decks running Dedenne GX right now is the fact that, much like with Crobat, you can't use duplicates of that same ability, meaning that once you've played your supporter for turn and you've used your Dede change ability with Dedenne GX, if you still don't have what you need, you previously were not able to keep digging, but now Crobat gives decks an option to keep on digging, or alternatively, even if you don't want to Dede change because you have some important pieces in your hand, now you can play Crobat V, use that Dark Acid ability, and instead draw up until you have 6 cards in your hand. Crobat V is not going anywhere. This is going to definitely continue to be one of the best support Pokemon going into next year. And with the Dedenne GX rotating next summer, this is only going to be a card that's going to increase in playability, I think. So Crobat V, fantastic card, going to come in at our number 5 spot. Coming in at number 4, we have another supporter card. This is going to be Boss's Orders. You switch one of your opponent's bench Pokemon with their active Pokemon. Now, typically when you're playing a supporter card, you usually want to be drawing cards. You know, that's why most decks are playing for Professor's Research and for Marnie. So when you're not actually drawing cards with your supporter for turn, that's a pretty big downside to the card. But even despite that, Boss's Orders is still going to clock in very high on this list. We've seen these effects over the years, whether it's Lysander back from the Flashfire set, or the slightly more recent Guzma back from Burning Shadows. These incarnations of this effect have seen massive play over the years. Basically every form of this effect has seen some degree of play, even going back further to cards like Gust of Wind or the pre-errata Pokemon Catcher. Boss's Orders is definitely here to stay, and thanks to cards like Eldegoss V, we can actually keep reusing these and find them on the turns that we need them as well. Gusting effects like this are one of the absolutely most powerful effects we've seen in the game. It's been that way since the beginning of the game. I don't think going into the new year, anything's going to change on that front. So Boss's Orders, for better or for worse, it is a card that is here to stay, and it's going to continue to be one of the most format-defining supporter cards that we have in the game currently. Speaking of supporter cards, though, we have Professor's Research climbing all the way up to the number 3 spot here for a pretty good reason. It's a supporter card that just says discard your hand and draw 7 cards. I think this is by far the best draw supporter effect that we've actually had over the years, whether it be in the form of Professor Juniper from Black and White or Professor Sycamore from XY. In a lot of card games, even drawing like 2 or 3 is considered like super broken. So the fact that Pokemon has a card like this that just draws you a straight 7 is a very strong effect that might be hard to appreciate if you haven't tried other card games in the past. And even though you do have to discard cards from your hand, there's a number of different decks as well that actually really don't mind discarding cards. One of the most obvious examples is going to be Zacian V that we have in the format, just because it has the powerful Metal Saucer item card at its disposal. So whenever you discard your metal energies, you can actually just get them right back out with that strong item card as well. So what's seen as a disadvantage from the card is actually an advantage for so many different decks out there. On a personal level, I'm not super happy that we have Professor's Research in the format over other things like Cynthia back from Ultra Prism, just as an easy example. But nevertheless, I can't let my own card design preferences override the fact that Professor's Research is just an insane card and easily the best draw supporter that exists in the game right now. And you guys knew it was coming. At some point, Zacian V was bound to make an appearance on this list. And as you can see, I've opted to include Zacian V and Metal Saucer both at the number 2 spot, just because I really don't think you can talk about one of these cards without talking about the other. So they're kind of just intrinsically linked in that way. But of course, Zacian V has gone on to almost define the state of the game that we have now. It very much so reminds me of cards like Mewtwo EX or Darkrai EX that just came to completely define the formats that they existed in when they were first printed. But Zacian V, it's one of these new Pokemon V that the Sword and Shield era introduced us to. It has the Intrepid Sword ability. You can look at the top 3 cards of your deck, attach any metal energies that you find there to this Pokemon, put the other cards in your hand, then your turn ends. And then it has the powerful Brave Blade attack for 3 metal, just 230, and this Pokemon can't attack during your next turn. So we've seen Zacian V get not only used as a primary attacker index, but even in some decks just for this ability alone because of how strong it can be to help set up your board in the early turns of the game, much like in the way that players used to play Tropical Beach, or even the recent Snorlax that came out in Vivid Voltage. And thanks to other cards like Arceus Dialga Palkia GX to buff this card's damage output even further, Zacian V has been known to climb up to damage caps that can even knock out opposing 3 prize Pokemon like some of the different tag teams that currently exist in the game. And of course, this card wouldn't be too much without its Metal Saucer companion, much like the old Dark Patch from back in the day or the more recent Aqua Patch. You attach a Metal Energy from your discard to one of your benched Metal Pokemon. So between this ability, between Metal Saucer, even with things like Turbo Patch that still exist in the format as well, Zacian V has no shortage of partners to get up and running. And you can really tell that Creatures Inc. when they designed this, they just printed a stupid amount of support for this thing. And that's why it's climbing all the way up to the number 2 spot on this countdown. And coming in at the top spot for my pick for the best card of 2020, it's going to be Quick Ball. I know this seems very anticlimactic. Quick Ball is not a particularly over-the-top card by any means, but it's an item card and it says you can only play this card if you discard another card from your hand. Then search your deck for a basic Pokemon, reveal it, put it into your hand. So pre-Quick Ball, our searching options that existed were absolutely terrible. You know, unless you were like a tag team deck that could have used something like Cherish Ball or like Electromagnetic Radar, our Pokemon search options were about to be horrible for 2020. So while Zacian V is most certainly, I think, the most impactful attacker in the game and widespread attacker we've seen this year, Quick Ball, I think, by far is the most impactful card just because without it, the vast majority of the decks and the format wouldn't even be able to function. They would instead be relying on cards like Great Ball or Pokemon Communication, and while these cards are fine and do see play, these are not really cards you want your primary form of Pokemon search to be based around, as they are much more limited in their own ways. And much like when discussing Professor's research, the discard effect really isn't even bad. Very frequently, you can discard energies to put in the discard that you can get out with things like Metal Saucer or Tapu Koko Prism Star. You also put supporters safely in the discard. That way they are always an Eldegoss V away from being able to have access to them. You can discard excess copies of cards you won't need in specific matchups. Quick Ball is overall just a huge slam dunk, and the format would actually be much worse without this card overall, despite how much it does help big basic decks, which are decks that typically I don't like seeing support for. But Quick Ball, it touches basically every deck that's in the format in some way, and without it, like I said, I think the format would be in a significantly worse place, making it, as you can see, my pick for the best card of the year. And with that, that's going to wrap up my picks for the 10 best Pokemon cards of 2020. We had, like I said, about 900 new cards printed this year, so narrowing them down to 10 was definitely a little bit tricky. There's definitely a few I wanted to be able to include that narrowly did miss making the top 10 here. And I'm sure some of those might even be some of the ones that you guys wish had appeared. So if I did miss some cards, I want you guys to sound off down below in the comment section. I want to know what you guys think the best cards of 2020 were. But that's going to wrap up things for today, guys. I really hope you enjoyed this countdown. If you did, of course, smack that like button and subscribe to the channel. And if you can, consider supporting this channel by becoming a patron at patreon.com/rarecandytcg or by picking up some merch at rarecandytcg.com. It would mean a lot. But as always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.